at 6:30 in the evening, two men were supposed to swallow something they had brought with them. Then they were supposed to put on lead masks. Then they were supposed to wait for a signal. Nobody knows what that signal was. Nobody knows what was inside the capsules. And nobody knows what happened during the final hours of their lives. 3 days later, their bodies would be discovered lying side by side on a lonely hill in Brazil. They were still wearing their formal clothes, still wearing their raincoats, and covering their eyes were crude masks made from lead. Beside them was a handwritten note. It contained a schedule, a capsule, a strange instruction about protecting metals, and one final command: wait for the signal. More than half a century later, the signal has never been explained. This is the Midnight Archive. Tonight, we are going to examine one of the strangest unexplained deaths ever recorded, the lid masks case. And this time, we're going to separate what we actually know from what people only think happened. Because the truth may be even stranger than the theories. August 1966. Brazil. The city of Niterói sits across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro, surrounded by hills, dense vegetation, and steep terrain. On the afternoon of August 20, a young boy went up Morro do Vintém, a hill overlooking the city. He was looking for something ordinary, a kite. Instead, he found something he would never forget. Two men were lying in the grass. They were side by side. They were dressed almost as if they had been preparing for a formal occasion. But there was nothing normal about the scene. Neither man appeared to have been violently attacked. There was no obvious struggle, no weapon lying nearby, no obvious explanation for why they were there. And over their eyes were strange homemade masks made from lead. The masks were not sophisticated. They were not military equipment. They were crude pieces of metal shaped to cover the eyes. The kind of object that immediately raises a question: why? Why would two men travel to a hilltop wearing lead masks? And more importantly, why would they die there? The discovery quickly became one of Brazil's most bizarre mysteries. The men were identified as Manoel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They were electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, and according to accounts of the investigation, they had traveled to Niterói several days before their bodies were discovered. That detail would become important, because the evidence suggested that their final trip had not been spontaneous. They had planned it. They had purchased items. They had watched the time. And they had carried written instructions. In other words, whatever happened on that hill may have begun days before they ever climbed it. The first question investigators had to answer was simple. What were two electronics technicians doing on top of a hill? At first, there was no obvious answer, but investigators soon found objects around the bodies. There was an empty water bottle. There were towels. There were other personal items. And most importantly, there were pieces of paper. One of those papers contained instructions that would become the center of the entire mystery. The wording has been translated in different ways because the original handwriting and punctuation are not perfectly preserved in every surviving account. But the general meaning is consistent. The men were instructed to arrive at a designated location at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. Then, at around 6:30, they were to ingest capsules. After the effect, they were to protect the metals, then wait for a signal. The wording is strange enough on its own, but one word changes everything. Signal. What signal? From whom? From where? And what were the men expecting to happen after they swallowed the capsules? There was no ordinary explanation written beside the instructions. No explanation of what the capsules contained. No explanation of who would provide the signal. No explanation of what "protect the metals" meant, and no explanation of why lead masks were necessary. The masks themselves immediately attracted attention. Lead is a dense metal commonly associated with shielding against certain forms of radiation. That fact helped create one of the most enduring theories surrounding the case. Perhaps the men believed they were going to encounter some kind of radiation. Perhaps they expected a strange light. Perhaps they were conducting an experiment. Perhaps they believed something would appear. Or perhaps the masks had an entirely different purpose. This is where the mystery becomes dangerous. Because once the lead masks entered the story, speculation exploded, and some of the speculation eventually turned toward UFOs. But there is an important distinction. There is evidence that the men planned something involving masks. There is evidence that they expected a signal. There is evidence that they were electronics technicians interested in technical subjects. But there is no conclusive evidence that extraterrestrials were involved. That part of the story is a theory. And yet, it wasn't invented from nothing. Because during the investigation, reports emerged of strange lights or an unusual object being seen in the area around the time the men were believed to have died. One contemporary newspaper account described a witness reporting an orange, oval-shaped object above the hill, surrounded by what appeared to be blue rays. The report became part of the mythology surrounding the case. But again, a reported sighting is not proof of a connection. The men could have been planning a private experiment. They could have believed in UFOs. They could have been participating in some kind of spiritual or occult practice. They could have been testing a substance. Or they could have been victims of a crime. The evidence never gave investigators the answer. And then there was another problem. The capsules were never found. Think about that. The most important physical object mentioned in the men's instructions, the object that might have explained everything, was missing. If the capsules contained a poison, investigators couldn't prove it. If they contained a drug, investigators couldn't prove it. If they contained something harmless, investigators couldn't prove that either. The note told the men to swallow something. The bodies were found. But the substance itself was gone. And the forensic investigation that followed would make the mystery even harder to solve. The bodies were not examined immediately under ideal conditions. The terrain was difficult. The authorities had trouble reaching the location. And by the time forensic examination took place, decomposition had already complicated the evidence. The official cause of death was ultimately left undetermined. There were no definitive findings that could explain why both men had died. And that single word, undetermined, would haunt the case for decades. Because without a cause of death, almost every theory remained alive. Poisoning, possible. Overdose, possible. Accidental experiment, suicide, possible. Murder, possible. Some kind of bizarre religious or spiritual ritual, possible. UFO-related experiment, possible. But none of them could be proven. And there was another strange detail. The masks were tested for radioactivity. They were not radioactive. That mattered. Because if the masks had been dangerously radioactive, the story would have taken a very different direction. But contemporary reporting stated that authorities found no trace of radioactivity in them. So the masks were real. The strange instructions were real. The deaths were real. But the supposed radiation threat had no physical confirmation. Which brings us to the question that may be more important than the masks themselves. Who were these men? Manoel and Miguel were not random strangers who happened to meet on a hill. They knew each other. They worked in electronics. They had traveled together. And accounts of the investigation suggest that they had some interest in technical experiments. This matters because it creates a very ordinary possible explanation for an extraordinary scene. They may have believed they were carrying out an experiment, a dangerous one. Perhaps they misunderstood something. Perhaps they trusted information that was wrong. Perhaps someone had convinced them that the experiment would produce a particular result. And perhaps the capsules were part of that experiment. But if that was the case, what experiment? Why the masks? Why the hill? Why the exact timing? And why wait for a signal? Those questions have never received a reliable answer. There was also another note. Investigators reportedly found a schedule involving capsules over several days. The instructions indicated different times for taking them, with a final entry associated with Wednesday. August 17, 1966 was a Wednesday. That was significant because August 17 was also the day the men were last seen alive. If the schedule was authentic and connected to the men, it suggested that whatever they were planning had been prepared in advance. They weren't simply walking onto the hill and making a decision. They may have been following a procedure, a sequence, step by step, day by day, and that makes the final note even more disturbing. Because the hill may not have been the beginning of the story, it may have been the final stage. On August 17, the men left Campos dos Goitacazes. They traveled toward Niterói. Their movements were later reconstructed through witnesses, receipts, and purchases. At some point they bought raincoats. They obtained water. They were seen paying attention to the time. And then they went toward the hill. There was nothing about their final journey that looked like a random disappearance. It looked deliberate. They knew where they were going. They had prepared for weather. They had something they intended to ingest. They had masks, and they had instructions. Then, they disappeared from the world. For 3 days, nobody knew exactly where they were. On August 20, their bodies were found, and investigators began reconstructing the final hours. The position of the bodies became important. They were lying next to each other. There was no obvious sign of a fight. No clear indication that one man had attacked the other. No obvious explanation for why they had remained there. The scene looked strangely organized, almost ritualistic, but appearances can be misleading. A crime scene can look bizarre, simply because investigators don't yet understand it. And a planned experiment can look like a ritual if the people conducting it leave behind strange objects. That is why this case is so difficult. Every piece of evidence seems meaningful, but almost none of it tells us exactly what happened. Consider the masks. If the men expected radiation, why use such crude masks? If they expected some kind of light, why not use ordinary protective goggles? If the masks were symbolic, why make them from lead? If someone else killed them, why leave the masks in place? If this was an experiment, what were they testing? And if they were waiting for a signal, why did no one ever come to meet them? Unless the signal was never supposed to come from another person. Perhaps they expected something in the sky. Perhaps they believed a phenomenon would appear. Perhaps they had been told to wait for a particular visual effect. Or perhaps signal meant something entirely different. The wording itself is uncertain enough that translation can alter the meaning. And that is one of the most important lessons of this case. A mysterious sentence can become even more mysterious after 50 years of retelling. Every new translation can make it sound more sinister. Every documentary can make it more dramatic. Every storyteller can turn an uncertain phrase into a definitive statement. But the original evidence does not necessarily justify that certainty. The truth is, we don't know. And we don't know is sometimes the most honest answer a mystery can have. There was another strange detail connected to the investigation. The men's personal belongings did not produce a simple explanation. Some of their possessions were still with them. There were no obvious signs that the men had simply been robbed and murdered for money. Yet reports about the amount of money they may have carried have varied. This has led to theories of robbery. But again, the numbers reported in different accounts are inconsistent. So even the money story has to be treated cautiously. What we can say is that they reportedly had access to a significant amount of money. What we cannot confidently say is exactly how much they carried to the hill or how much was missing. That distinction matters. Because mysteries grow when uncertain numbers become facts. And this case has accumulated decades of those kinds of claims. Then there is the question of suicide. Some researchers have suggested that the men may have intentionally consumed something dangerous. The scheduled capsules would fit that possibility, but there was no conventional suicide note explaining their intentions. Instead, there was a procedural note. instructions, timing, a signal, masks. That makes the possibility difficult to interpret. If they intentionally died, what were they expecting to happen? Were they testing a substance? Did they believe they would survive? Were they expecting some transformation? Or did something go wrong? Perhaps they never intended to die at all. Perhaps they believed the capsules would produce an effect that was temporary or controllable. And perhaps whatever they took was far more dangerous than they realized. This is one of the more grounded possibilities. But it remains a possibility, not a conclusion, because the capsules were never recovered, and the forensic evidence was not sufficient to identify what killed them. The investigation suffered another enormous setback. The biological material needed for toxicological analysis was compromised. As a result, investigators could not reliably answer the most basic forensic question: what was inside their bodies? Without that answer, the entire case became an enormous circle. The note suggests capsules. The capsules are missing. The bodies contain no definitive forensic explanation. And the evidence that could have revealed poisoning was unavailable or too compromised to settle the question. The case therefore became a perfect storm for speculation. One theory said the men were conducting an experiment. Another suggested poisoning. Another suggested a spiritual ritual. Another suggested a UFO encounter. Another suggested they had been manipulated by someone else. And some theories combined all of these ideas. But the evidence refuses to cooperate. There is no confirmed extraterrestrial connection. There is no confirmed poison. There is no confirmed murderer. There is no confirmed experiment. There is only a strange sequence of events and two dead men. The UFO theory became especially famous because of the reported strange object seen above the hill. The witness account described an orange or oval object with unusual lights or rays. The story appeared in contemporary reporting. But even if the sighting occurred exactly as described, it doesn't establish what killed the men. The two events could be connected, or they could be completely unrelated. This is the difference between coincidence and causation. The men may have gone to the hill because they expected to see something, or the witness may have seen something unrelated while the men were already dead. Without reliable timing and physical evidence connecting the two events, the UFO theory remains speculation. Still, imagine being the investigators. You have two bodies, two strange metal masks, a bottle of water, written instructions, capsules that are nowhere to be found, a strange witness report, and no obvious cause of death. Every answer creates another question. If it was poison, where is the poison? If it was an experiment, what were they experimenting with? If it was murder, where is the killer? If it was suicide, why the elaborate procedure? If it was UFO contact, where is the physical evidence? The investigation could not close the gaps. And eventually, time did what time always does. It destroyed evidence. Memories faded. Documents disappeared. The men remained dead. The masks became artifacts, and the case became legend. But there is one final detail that makes the story especially unsettling. The men didn't appear to be fleeing something. They were not found running. They were not found hiding. They had gone to the hill voluntarily. They had brought what they needed. They followed a schedule. They put on the masks, and then nothing. No confirmed signal, no confirmed visitor, no confirmed experiment, no explanation, just silence. Imagine standing on that hill at 6:30 in the evening, the city below you, the sky beginning to darken, two men beside you, a capsule in your hand, a piece of metal covering your eyes, and instructions telling you to wait. Wait for what? You don't know. Maybe they believed something extraordinary was about to happen. Maybe they had been deceived. Maybe they had misunderstood science. Maybe they were experimenting with a substance they did not understand. Maybe they were participating in a belief system that made perfect sense to them. Or maybe there is a missing piece of the story that investigators never found. That is what makes the lead mask's case different from an ordinary, unsolved death. It isn't simply a question of who killed them. It is a question of what they thought they were doing. Because whatever happened, they seem to have chosen that hill. They seem to have followed a plan, and they seem to have expected something. The masks tell us that. The note tells us that. The timing tells us that. But none of those things tells us what the expectation was. More than 5 decades have passed. The hill has changed. The city has changed. Technology has changed. The people who first investigated the case are mostly gone. But the question remains exactly where it was in 1966. Why did 2 men climb a hill wearing lead masks? And what happened after they waited for the signal? Perhaps one day, a missing document will surface. Perhaps a forgotten witness will remember something. Perhaps an old notebook will explain the capsules. Or perhaps the final answer disappeared with the men themselves. There is one thing we can say with certainty. They were real. The hill was real. The masks were real. The note was real. Their deaths were real. And the unanswered questions are real. Everything beyond that belongs to the realm of possibility. Maybe the men were trying to protect themselves from something they believed was coming. Maybe they were trying to see something they believed existed. Maybe they were conducting an experiment. Maybe they were victims of something entirely ordinary that only looks extraordinary because the evidence was lost. And maybe the strangest part of the story is not that 2 men died wearing lead masks. It's that they may have known exactly what they were waiting for. We simply don't. On that hill in Brazil, sometime after the men followed their final instructions, the waiting ended. Whatever they expected, whatever they believed, whatever they thought would happen next, never became part of the record. There was no final message, no explanation, no confirmed signal, only 2 bodies beneath the sky, and 2 masks covering their eyes. The world kept moving. The mystery didn't. This has been the Midnight Archive. And sometimes, the darkest mysteries aren't the ones where someone disappears. They're the ones where the evidence survives, but the answer doesn't.